The glass walls of our loop conference room reflected the gray Chicago skyline, making the space feel colder than it already was. I steadied my breath. My notes spread neatly in front of me, charts lined up in the margins. This was my quarterly forecast, the analysis I had labored over for 3 sleepless weeks. It was supposed to be my chance to prove that I could steer the company away from the cliff it was speeding toward. I didn't even make it past my second slide before Reginald Voss leaned forward, his voice booming with false charm. "What Claudine is trying to say," he interrupted, "is that our margins need more creative thinking. Let's not bog ourselves down in numbers right now." My pen traced a line across the corner of my notes. One more tally mark among many. By the end of the meeting, 19 dark strokes scarred the page. Across the table, Dorian Hale delivered his marketing updates uninterrupted, basking in nods and chuckles. Wyatt Stroud followed with a 20-minute technical breakdown that no one dared cut short. I clenched my jaw, holding my silence. My work, the survival map for this company, was treated like background noise. When the meeting finally ended, I gathered my papers slowly, my stomach twisting. I slipped into my office, shut the door, and opened my laptop to clear my inbox. Among the routine follow-ups and project notes sat a message chain forwarded to me by mistake. The subject line read, "Next week's prep, keep her contained." My eyes scanned the thread. Dorian's words were smug, typed too quickly to disguise his intent. "We can't let Mercer dominate when Preston Harwood's on the line. Keep her off balance. If she looks unprepared, Reginald can step in and save face." Wyatt had chimed in beneath agreed. "We'll redirect whenever she pushes numbers too far. Investor doesn't need her theatrics." I stared at the screen, pulse pounding. 19 interruptions had felt like negligence. But this was no accident. It was a plan, written out in black and white. I closed the email, leaned back in my chair, and gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles blanched. They weren't just dismissing me. They were preparing to erase me. The realization left me colder than the skyline outside, and already I could feel the decision forming for what I would have to do next. When I first walked away from Boston, people called me reckless. I had a secure position at a consultancy firm, predictable hours, and a paycheck that covered more than my needs. But Reginald Voss painted such a seductive picture equity that could multiply. A company hungry for fresh ideas and the promise of real autonomy. "We need someone who can redesign the financial engine," he had told me, leaning across the cafe table during our first meeting. I wanted to believe him. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and moved into a modest apartment near Wrigleyville. It smelled faintly of the last tenant's burnt coffee and linoleum floor polish. But it was mine, and it felt like the beginning of something bigger. I told myself that every sacrifice the cross-country move, the downgrade in salary, was an investment in the future. The first weeks seemed to justify my gamble. My memos circulated across teams. People scribbled notes as I explained inefficiencies. Reginald himself praised my clarity of vision. For a moment, I thought I had found a place where merit mattered. Then came the slow erosion. The first time I laid out an implementation plan, Dorian interrupted mid-sentence, and Reginald redirected the conversation as though I hadn't spoken at all. Wyatt followed weeks later with the same tactic. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was too technical, too fast, too thorough. I cut slides, simplified models, rehearsed late into the night with ramen cups stacked beside my laptop. Still, the interruptions multiplied. Meanwhile, fragments of my strategies reappeared in meetings, repackaged by others as if they had conceived them. I would hear my phrasing echoed in Reginald's pitches, my projections trimmed down and delivered as his fresh insight. The applause never found its way back to me. I kept pushing, working deeper into the numbers, convinced that if I could just prove the path to survival, cut costs here, redirect resources there, they'd have to listen. But with every tally mark drawn across my notes, the truth pressed harder on me. My dedication wasn't building trust. It was being stolen piece by piece. And still, I told myself I had to endure because the company's lifeline might depend on me. Reginald's voice carried easily across the conference table, smug with self-importance. "Next week, Preston Harwood himself will be joining our call," he announced, as though the words alone secured the $120 million renewal. The room buzzed, shoulders straightening, eyes flickering with nervous ambition. I sat still, the email chain about keeping me contained echoing louder than his announcement. If they were plotting to undercut me, this was the stage they had chosen. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled my laptop closer and typed into the search bar Illinois recording law's single-party consent. My pulse quickened as I scrolled through the statutes. Relief washed over me. As long as one party to the conversation consented and that party could be me, it was legal. I leaned back in my chair, a small knot in my chest loosening. The next morning, I purchased a discreet recording app, something designed for journalists. Its icon blended innocently among the others on my phone. I tested it in my kitchen, speaking into the quiet space, then playing it back, crisp, clear, undeniable. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had leverage. Later that evening, over wine at a dimly lit bar in Lincoln Park, I confided in Iris Delgado. She had been my anchor since Boston, a litigation attorney who had fought her own battles in male-dominated rooms. She listened carefully, tapping her finger against the stem of her glass. "Claudine," she said, her tone even. "Evidence is power. But it's also danger. Once you record, you hold something they fear. People lash out when cornered." I nodded, already knowing she was right. Still, the thought of sitting through another humiliation without recourse was unbearable. This wasn't about revenge or winning a personal duel. It was about survival, mine, and the company's. When I walked home that night, the chill wind off the lake pressed against my coat. I tightened it and gripped my phone in my pocket, knowing what I had to do. The next meeting would not just be another tally on my notes, it would be the proof I needed. The following week, the air inside the conference room felt heavier than usual, charged with a nervous energy that no one dared name. I slipped into my chair early, my phone placed face down beside my notes. With a quiet tap, the recording app began its silent work. Reginald paced at the head of the table, rehearsing phrases that sounded polished but hollow. Synergy, innovation pipeline, client-centered solutions, buzzwords stacked like dominoes ready to fall. His voice swelled with confidence, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, the restless shift of his hands. He knew what was at stake. Across from me, Dorian leaned toward Wyatt, their whispers too faint to carry across the room, but clear enough in intent. Their eyes flicked toward me, then down at their notes, as if aligning on the timing of their strikes. My stomach knotted, though my face remained steady. When the screen flickered to life, Preston Harwood's image filled the wall. Silver hair, sharp gray eyes, the faint impatience of a man who valued time above all else. He greeted us briefly. No indulgence for small talk. Then cut straight to the point. "Let's hear where things stand." Reginald launched into his prepared speech, puffed with statistics that danced around the truth. Wyatt followed with a polished update on infrastructure milestones. Neither suffered interruption. Neither drew a skeptical glance from the man on the screen. Then, Reginald turned toward me. "Claudine will walk you through our financial outlook," he said, his voice clipped, almost dismissive. I steadied my breathing, glanced once at my phone, then rose slightly in my seat. "Thank you. I've prepared a full analysis of our current position and projections." My slides illuminated the wall, numbers crisp, charts precise. Each word I delivered felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge, fully aware that Dorian and Wyatt were poised to saw at the planks beneath me. I could almost predict the rhythm of their interruptions before they came. And yet, with Preston's eyes fixed on me, unblinking and appraising, I felt the smallest flicker of hope that the pattern might not go unnoticed this time. I advanced to my third slide, outlining projected margins tied to adjusted acquisition costs, when Dorian leaned forward with his familiar smirk. Those assumptions feel overly optimistic. Claudine, perhaps we should ground this in more conservative models before misleading anyone. His voice carried the tone of a reprimand, not a contribution. I tightened my grip on the remote, but kept my expression even. 2 minutes later, Wyatt cut in, arms folded across his chest. These projections ignore infrastructure strain. Without factoring back-end load, the revenue streams you're showing don't hold. Before I could respond, Nolan, our product director, raised his hand halfway and jumped in. If I could just add user growth metrics. The sound that followed silenced all of us. Preston Harwood clearing his throat, low, deliberate, and heavier than any interruption. 3 interruptions, he said, his gaze sweeping the table. In under 10 minutes. This is exactly why we're reconsidering. The room froze. Reginald's complexion drained to ash. Dorian's smirk collapsed into something hollow, and Wyatt shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated by his notepad. Preston's voice cut through the silence. Let Ms. Mercer finish. Without interruption, the authority in his tone felt like a lifeline. I steadied myself and continued, laying out the full strategy I had spent weeks perfecting a path to triple revenue in 18 months, reduce operating costs by 27%, and redirect resources toward high-value clients. The numbers were tight, the logic unshakable. For the first time, I delivered it in full. When I finished, Preston leaned back, his gray eyes narrowing slightly as he studied me. Then he nodded once, firmly. That, he said, is precisely the level of strategic thinking I expect. So tell me, why am I hearing this only now? The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed, and I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me as though the truth alone might ignite the room. Preston didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned forward, elbows on the polished conference table, and spoke with the precision of a judge handing down a sentence. Here's where we stand. The renewal can proceed, but only under certain conditions. His eyes swept the room before landing squarely on Reginald. First, Ms. Mercer is promoted to Chief Strategy Officer, reporting directly to me, not filtered through your existing structure. The silence deepened, thick and brittle. I felt my pulse in my throat, but I didn't flinch. Second, Preston continued, your leadership team will undergo mandatory communication and inclusion training, with quarterly assessments. I won't fund a culture that silences its most valuable thinkers. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Dorian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Reginald's hands twitched against the armrests, but he said nothing. And third, Preston said, his voice sharper now, Ms. Mercer's full strategy will be implemented, not piecemeal, not repackaged under other names, in full. I glanced at Reginald, watching his carefully constructed confidence unravel. He looked cornered, trapped between pride and survival. The prospect of losing Preston's contract and the $120 million lifeline it carried was more than he could risk. After a long pause, his voice cracked into the silence. Of course, we can accommodate those conditions. Preston wasn't finished. One more thing. I want Ms. Mercer on my external advisory board. I've seen enough to know her perspective extends beyond this company. The words landed with the weight of an unexpected crown. Advisory board, direct access to Preston's portfolio, a separate compensation package, independence from data streams politics. In one stroke, I had leapfrogged the entire leadership team who had spent months cutting me down. I steadied my breath, nodded once, and met Preston's gaze. He gave the faintest hint of a smile, as if to say the verdict was sealed. Across the table, Reginald's face had gone pale, but his eyes flickered with something else, something that warned me the fight wasn't over, only changing shape. The moment Preston signed off, The conference room dissolved into a blur of forced smiles and stiff handshakes. "Congratulations," someone muttered without meeting my eyes. Dorian clapped me on the shoulder with just enough pressure to make it sting, his jaw tight behind the gesture. Wyatt avoided me entirely, rifling through his notes as though the paper might hide his resentment. I left with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, the weight of their whispers trailing behind me. Back in my office, Reginald appeared in the doorway, his usual swagger reduced to something quieter. He smoothed his tie and offered a smile that trembled around the edges. "Claudine, I want to apologize for the dynamics in those meetings. You know how these things get. We value you enormously." His gaze drifted to the phone on my desk, the screen still dark, face down as it had been in the meeting. For a flicker of a moment, his expression hardened. "You didn't record today, did you?" I met his eyes, steady and unblinking. "Yes, for my protection." He blinked, caught between outrage and caution. "Well, as long as we can keep things professional moving forward." His words hung in the air like smoke before he retreated, leaving me with the hollow echo of his apology. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I replayed sections of the recording. The interruptions sounded even sharper in playback Dorian's cutting tone, Wyatt's dismissive interjections, Nolan's eager chiming in. But beneath the noise, another detail emerged, chilling me. Dorian's voice, low and casual. During one of my slides, "Tweak those numbers, shift them down a few points. We'll present safer projections." My stomach clenched. This wasn't just undermining me. This was sabotage, altering data in real time to make me appear careless. The proof sat in my hands, crisp and undeniable. I closed the file and leaned back, the city lights flickering outside my window. The recording had given me more than protection, it had given me their confession. The only question now was how long I should wait before using it. Stepping into the role of Chief Strategy Officer was less a promotion than a declaration of war. The first week, I began reshaping the departments, pulling budgets from vanity projects and redirecting resources toward the core strategy Preston had approved. Meetings grew tense. Eyes narrowed when I walked into a room. Some welcomed the clarity, but others clung to the old inefficiencies like lifelines. Wyatt Stroud proved the loudest opponent. In a development review, he pushed his chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You cut features our engineers spent years building. You're dismantling systems without understanding their complexity. Let's be honest, you got lucky the client liked you." The words stung, but I didn't let them show. I slid a spreadsheet across the table, rows of numbers highlighted in red. "This is 18 months of infrastructure spending mapped against user adoption, 43% above industry averages, sustaining features used by less than 7% of our clients." I flipped to the next page, projections bolded in black. "Redirecting those resources increases revenue by 28% within 6 months. That's not luck. That's data." Wyatt's face darkened, his jaw flexing. Anger. Yes, but beneath it, I saw the fear he couldn't quite bury. His empire of waste was collapsing, and he knew it. When the meeting adjourned, I caught the flicker of Dorian pulling him aside, their heads bent close, voices too low to catch. I didn't need to hear the words to know the shape of them. They weren't finished with me. That night, I replayed the recording again, the moment Dorian whispered about shifting numbers. The file remained untouched on my phone, my insurance policy. If they thought they could twist the narrative back in their favor, they were forgetting one thing I already had their confession captured in their own voices. The next confrontation would not be about interruptions. It would be about survival, and only one side could win. The all-hands meeting was staged like a celebration. Reginald stood at the front of the room, polished smile in place, his tone warm and commanding. "We've secured Preston Harwood's full support," he declared. The new terms reflect our leadership's vision for growth, and I rose from my seat before he could finish. For the first time since I'd joined the company, I cut him off. Actually, that isn't how it happened. Murmurs rippled through the rows of employees. Reginald's eyes narrowed, but I was already moving. I placed my phone on the table and tapped the screen. The recording spilled into the room. Dorian's voice came first, sharp and dismissive. Those assumptions feel overly optimistic. Claudine. Then Wyatt. Without factoring back-end load, these numbers don't hold. Reginald's laugh followed, careless and dismissive, a sound meant to belittle. And then Preston's voice, steady and cold. 3 interruptions in under 10 minutes. This is exactly why we're reconsidering. The room gasped as one. A few hands flew to mouths. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The interruptions echoed against the walls, no longer hidden behind closed doors. The truth stood exposed, undeniable. Reginald's face flushed crimson. Dorian's smirk had long since vanished, replaced by a tight grimace. Wyatt stared at the floor, jaw locked. I let the silence linger before speaking. This was the reality of our leadership meetings. What you just heard is what Preston heard. That's why the conditions were set, not because of anyone's vision, but because the truth could no longer be ignored. The weight in the room shifted. Some eyes turned to me with recognition, others with relief, as if they had been waiting for someone to say aloud what they already knew. The myth of control Reginald had cultivated cracked clean through. As I shut off the recording, the room seemed to tilt. Humiliation had done its work, but the question pressing on me now was whether it would be enough or whether the reckoning had only just begun. The fallout was swift. Within 48 hours, the board convened an emergency session. Reginald sat stiff in his chair as the verdict came down. He was stripped of his CEO title, replaced by an interim leader until a permanent successor could be named. His protests barely rose above a whisper, drowned out by the weight of Preston's influence and the clarity of the evidence. Dorian and Wyatt fared no better. Their names surfaced alongside the recording, tied to deliberate sabotage and misconduct. By the end of the week, both were escorted out of the building, their badges disabled, their offices emptied. Rumors spread quickly. But the truth was louder than speculation. Everyone had heard the recording. Everyone had seen their arrogance unravel in public. Preston's announcement came the following Monday. Standing before the assembled staff, his tone was matter of fact. During this transition, Ms. Mercer will serve as acting CEO. She has demonstrated the vision and resilience required to lead. The future of this company is safer in her hands. Applause followed, hesitant at first. Then, building. I nodded, steady. Though my chest thudded with the enormity of it, I had walked into this building as a strategist. Now I carried the responsibility of rebuilding an entire culture. Months passed in a blur of decisions, late nights, and quiet victories. Revenue climbed, costs dropped, and more importantly, meetings transformed. Voices once silenced now filled the air. The space reshaped into something closer to what it should have been all along. When I finally stood on stage at an industry conference, presenting DataStream's turnaround, the room pulsed with attention. Slides flashed metrics: 67% revenue growth, 31% cost reduction. Applause thundered at the close. Then I saw him, Dorian, lingering at the back, suit wrinkled, eyes hollow. For a moment, our gazes met. I didn't flinch. I closed the keynote with words I had waited months to say. 19 interruptions built my resolve. One recording built my future. Silence me once, but never again. The applause roared, and the thought rose in me like fire. What if the next company I lead still thinks they can silence me?